Today's video is sponsored by Dragon City. At long last, the HD Switch port of The Legend of Zelda Skyward Sword is finally out. I actually never got through the original game when it first came out, so I've been pretty excited about this Switch port for a while. I don't think it's necessary to mention that Skyward Sword is a pretty divisive entry in the series, but I wanted to go into this with a positive mindset and give this game a legitimate shot. So today, let's have a little chat about my history with this game and my updated experience with the HD version. But first, I want to take a minute to talk about the sponsor of this video, Dragon City. If you're anything like me, you probably think dragons are pretty sick. I pretty much get excited whenever I see a dragon in like any form of media. Ever wanted a game where you can collect and train your very own literal army of dragons? Well, have I got some good news for you. Today's video happens to be sponsored by a game called Dragon City. Dragon City is a free-to-play game available on both iOS and Android, but also available on Windows and Amazon. There's over 1,000 different dragons to collect in the game to build your very own Dragon City. You can even breed 2 different dragons to get entirely new ones and then feed them to evolve them. Training your dragons and battling them also makes them grow and become more powerful. There's different PvP modes that let you fight against your friends and challenge other dragon masters from all over, so if you're super competitive, pitting your dragons against others is something you'll definitely want to check out. There's also a whole bunch of events every week to discover and experience new adventures. Who knows, you may even see some of your favorite YouTubers in the game. If you click on the link in the description, you'll get a special free reward of 15,000 food and 30,000 gold, plus the rare Citadel dragon, but these will only be available to new users until August 5th. So if you want to check out a completely free-to-play game about collecting and battling dragons among a slew of other features, and if you want to help support my channel, click on the link in the description to download the game and also receive your exclusive promotional reward. And big thanks to Dragon City for sponsoring this video. So let me start this off by giving you guys a little history about my experience with this game when it originally came out. I've been a huge Zelda fan my entire life, literally since I was like 4 years old, and I've followed the series closely since then, so every time a new Zelda comes out, I'm right there eagerly awaiting its release. Despite not being particularly sold on Skyward Sword's aesthetics, I was just excited about a new Zelda game at all, and the fact that it came with a limited edition gold Wii remote was even more incentive to grab this thing on day one. Not that I wouldn't have done that anyway, but it's a detail. After playing Twilight Princess on the Wii, I wasn't super keen on the fact that this was once again going to be a motion-controlled game, but I personally love Twilight Princess as a game, and I was able to look past the controls when I played it, so naturally, I wasn't ready to judge Skyward Sword on that. Of course, I would have preferred a more traditional control method, but I also didn't just assume it would turn the game into something I disliked. Boy, was I wrong. Obviously, I had the same complaints everyone else has. The slow opening section, Fi interrupting every 4 seconds, the hand-holding, the typical complaints you hear when people complain about Skyward Sword. The controls, though, ended up being a detriment for me. Look, I'll acknowledge that plenty of people had no problem with them, but I, along with many others, found the motion-controlled swordplay infuriating. The worst of which was the fact that half the time, Link didn't want to charge up the Skyward Strike unless the Wii Remote was pointed in an ever-so-perfect position. It wasn't totally broken, obviously, but it was a far cry from anything I'd call reliable. Needing to shake the nunchuck for the shield wasn't doing the game any favors either, and while yes, this was all doable and didn't necessarily make the game unplayable, I don't know about any of you, but when I play video games, I'm slouching and contorting my body like a fucking pretzel. When I'm playing a game, I rarely sit up, let alone sit up straight, and this game sort of requires that. Kinda hard to swing the Wii Remote and shake the nunchuck when you're leaning sideways against a pillow. I'm sure a lot of people didn't have this problem, but if I can't play a game comfortably, it's gonna be a hard sell for me. There were so many other elements that I didn't particularly like, things I wasn't used to, like shields breaking, for example, coupled with all the other quirks this game seemed to have, that I dropped it at like the 2nd dungeon. I didn't even make a conscious decision to stop playing it. I just got Skyward bored and dropped it, never touching it again. It's no secret that Skyward Sword is one of the most divisive Zelda games ever released, and a lot of people hated on it for a long time. But the conversation around it has started to shift in recent years, with lots of people touting it as having some of the best dungeon design in the entire series. I honestly always wanted to pick it up again and give it another shot, thinking that I judged it unfairly, but I just never got around to it. Every time I had the thought to give it another go, I would always end up holding back in hopes that one day the game would re-release in a more accessible fashion. I guess this was a good call because, well, here we are. Let's talk about Skyward Sword HD. Real quick, if you're liking the video and you want to see more, just a reminder to maybe subscribe if you want to see what I do, all right? All right, that's all I gotta say. Alright, so I'm sure you guys already know the deal by now. Fi is unobtrusive, almost never jumping in your face unless absolutely necessary, and even then, her dialogue can be fast-forwarded. NPCs no longer break pacing and forcefully engage you in dialogue. All the NPCs that typically would do that are now optional to engage with. Cutscenes are skippable, which, while this game is very story-driven and I obviously wouldn't recommend doing that on a first playthrough, it's definitely nice to have for repeat playthroughs. The game runs in 1080p 60, which further helps the motion controls that have been all but fixed if you choose to use them. The Joy-Cons are a lot more precise than the Wii Motion Plus ever was, and despite needing to use a button to recenter sometimes, they're much more viable, and they're helped even further by the increased frame rate. The biggest draw, though, for me at least, is the option to not need to use that shit at all. Look, I appreciate different peripherals and ways to play games, but the last thing I want to do is be forced to play in an unconventional way with a series I've been playing since I was a kid. I just want to play Zelda with a controller, man. Well, Skyward Sword HD has remedied this. Finally. I can sit comfortably any way I want and use the right analog stick to control the sword. Glorious, and no motion control issues. And speaking of that right analog stick, the camera can now be controlled, which is also a much needed inclusion. You need to hold down the left shoulder button to control it while in button-only mode, but it's honestly a small price to pay, and I got used to it pretty quickly. In my opinion, it becomes second nature pretty fast. Now, for context, I had, for the longest time, thought that I liked Breath of the Wild more than Skyward Sword, based solely on the fact that I actually beat Breath of the Wild and couldn't be bothered to even get halfway through Skyward Sword. Fun fact, I kind of fucking hate Breath of the Wild. At first, I thought I kinda sorta liked it a little, but the more time that passes since I've played it, the less and less I can think of things that I actually enjoyed about it. I know that's a pretty unpopular opinion, but most of the things people complain about in Skyward Sword, I feel similarly about Breath of the Wild, only on the complete opposite side of the spectrum. I mean, let's face it, they're essentially polar opposites, but this whole time I thought that I vehemently hated Skyward Sword just because I liked a game that I didn't even really like more than I liked Skyward Sword. Turns out I was very wrong. Never have I flip-flopped so hard on a game I thought I hated. Now, I'm only about 10 hours into Skyward Sword, but even this early on, I'm getting more out of this game than I ever got out of Breath of the Wild. Turns out, everyone was right about the dungeon design. And funny enough, that's the biggest thing I felt Breath of the Wild was lacking. I feel like I could have looked past all the things I found lackluster or unengaging about Breath of the Wild if they had just included traditional dungeons. Turns out I would have had that exact feeling about Skyward Sword this whole time, had I just given it a real chance the first time around. I really don't want to make this a Skyward Sword versus Breath of the Wild thing, but it's honestly really hard to avoid making these comparisons considering how much they really epitomize two extremes of the series in terms of design. I really don't have a ton to say about it other than I'm really enjoying it. I clearly prefer the more linear approach to Skyward Sword with traditional dungeons. I'll admit it did take it a little too far with its linearity, but I would choose this game with its super interesting dungeons over Breath of the Wild any day, and that doesn't necessarily speak to either game's quality, it's just a matter of taste and perspective. The problem is, for like a decade now, I thought this was a bad game, and it's totally not. It's a misunderstood game with a lot of good level design that a lot of people might have been able to discover had the barrier of entry not have been a bunch of bullshit that a lot of people didn't want to deal with. Luckily, Skyward Sword HD fixes literally every single one of these issues, and I think the game can finally be appreciated for what it is at its core. I've heard there are some segments in the game that are essentially padding, but if this game keeps up what it's been doing with its dungeon design and puzzles, I'm sure I can easily look past that. Plenty of Zelda games have really bad padding in them, and I still love them. I'm looking at you, Wind Waker. And one last thing, the price. I'm pretty sure I'm in the minority when I say this, but I genuinely never care when Nintendo charges $60 for a game, especially a game from one of its biggest flagship series. I mean, Donkey Kong Country Tropical Freeze was a more budget-friendly title when it first released, and they jacked the price up to $60 when they ported it to the Switch, and a lot less was done to that game than Skyward Sword. Is Funky Kong really worth an upcharge? I think it's more a matter of Nintendo knowing what their series is worth, and quite frankly, a full-length 3D Zelda game is worth $60. The fact that this originally was a Wii game isn't really a great argument in my opinion, and for a lot of people, including myself, this is basically a brand new Zelda game. In fact, if I base a game's worth on how much enjoyment I got out of it, I should be a lot more pissed about spending $60 on Breath of the Wild. And yes, I know the Zelda remakes on Wii U were cheaper, but also, no one bought a fucking Wii U, so they were probably a little more willing to take what they could get. Switch is selling like hotcakes, so I think it's warranted. Do I wish it was cheaper? Sure.
But as a game, it's easily worth $60, and there's never been a time in my life where I looked back fondly at a game I enjoyed and thought to myself, damn, I would have liked that game way more if it was $10 cheaper. Anyway, go play Skyward Sword HD if you're a Zelda fan who never experienced the original. It's really a fun time. It remains to be seen whether or not this is a top-tier Zelda game, but so far, I've been having a lot more fun with it than I ever thought I would. And once again, thanks to Dragon City for sponsoring this video. If you want to check it out, click my link down below. Sponsors are a big help, man. Hey, thanks for watching the video. If you liked it and want to see more, there's a couple other videos right there you can check out. And if you want to see everything I upload, subscribe and then tap the bell icon. And if you want to help support the channel, I also have a Patreon right there too.